Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath Bow Wow, coming back at you with another episode of Archon's Armory. Now today we'll be talking about Necron weapons, focusing on small arms and melee weapons. This is the first in a short series on Xenos weaponry that will be coming out, as mentioned in my last post, so without further ado, let's jump right into it. Now, the first thing is that a lot of the mythos talk for the Xenos weapons is going to be a bit different, as I can't necessarily say that there are misconceptions so much as there are just things that need to be explained. Let's start off with the Necrons. Their idea is that they have perfected ancient weapons, that it's all high technology equipment, and that it is absolutely custom-made perfection from the ancient times. Now, this is not necessarily so untrue in the technology department, but it is untrue when it comes to the technical, logistical areas of Necron weaponry. So, Necron weapons were designed for a war that ended literal millennia ago, and their updating ability with many of their weapons isn't great. They're very good weapons, but they were designed for a war that is long past. They're still very effective, but they're not perfect for absolutely everything, and updating them can kind of be a nightmare sometimes. So, technology intentionally created, or the results of the flesh change. Now, as we know, the Necrons as a race are a result of essentially a bad deal with some giant space creatures, the Catan, that created or turned a race of living people who were on a very unfortunate world and just happened to hate everyone around them, transformed them into living metal monsters that are created out of, well, metal, specifically a living metal. It is a material that is part metal and part high biopolymer. It's a very confusing thing, but effectively it acts like metal. A lot of their weapons were developed before that period. In some cases, it was because they were being used to fight enemies, and on other cases, it was actually because they developed them themselves. But due to the flesh change, some of these weapons are a little bit different. Some of them are fused into the Necrons involved. This is the case with a lot of vehicles and some of the heavily modified leadership of the Necron army. So their weapons are kind of a result of the flesh change, or they are affected by the flesh change. This is consistent throughout a lot of their weaponry. While it's not necessarily a thing that, like, well, you know, Necrons are just attached to their guns physically like Tyranids are, they aren't necessarily swapping out guns on the fly as easily, especially because they are not all that independently minded. They're not hive-minded or anything, but they're not all that smart, and since their weapons kind of work a little bit, at least, against most targets, there's not a lot of squad building necessarily with the Necrons. And a lot of their weapons have changed or been modified to cope with the flesh change and with the changes to the Necron biology more than anything else. The second one, and this is something that I'm going to talk about at length, is does size matter for the Necron weaponry? So, we see a lot of weapons that only work on certain large Necron constructs, whether that's because it requires extra power, or it just requires a larger chassis in order to use, isn't clear, but it does seem to apply that at least with some, like, versions of Gaus Weapons, and with some other versions of field-producing weapons, that bigger is better. However, there are also some versions of weapons that only have two variants, a heavy and a pistol. They don't really have an in-between option, so we'll talk about that when it comes to types of weapons, but just understand that the size and the unit that's using the weapon actually does matter quite a bit for how it operates. And then finally, unique versus common weaponry. So there's a lot of really specialty stuff for the Necrons, things like tachyon arrows, things like different scepters and staves for the various, like, patriarchs and leaders of the Necron empires. We're not going to be going into that as much. Some of them share weapon types with some of the things that we'll be going over, but they're not really common weapons. So some of those relic weapons, some of those hyper-specific weapons, including grenades and stuff like that, we're not going to go into them here. We might go into them later if we ever do a character breakdown, but for the moment, let's move on. The reality of Necron weaponry, and I know I'm not doing so much on the images here. I will talk about a couple of these because they go into some of the designs, but the reality of the weapons is they don't really have a lot of kinetic weapons. Almost all of them are using either a projected field, a force or an energy source, a specific power, some sort of electronic or sometimes downright like arcane power, like ancient technology, and pulses. I'll talk about the difference of those when I go into the different types of weapons. The second one is that a lot of their weapons are using star matter or straight up space magic. So things that kind of exist within 40k lore, things like teleportation, things like disintegration, they have parallels along different factions' weaponry, but a lot of it is just downright space magic, in that quite a bit of their weaponry doesn't actually have all the mechanical complexity that modern factions do. Again, they might be purely scientific, it might actually be a purely technological reason, but the Flesh Change has also modified how a lot of their weapons work. And some of them work very strangely, as they would kind of not, or maybe not work as well in human hands, so to speak. So, certain weapons that are attached to Necrons, certain very complicated technological weapons, might be straight up space magic and not work necessarily exactly in the hands of a human how they would in the hands of a Necron. Questionable whether that's just using all that, like, star matter stuff, things like creating black hole guns, negative energy particles, or dark matter. All of that is, theoretically you could get that, but whether or not it actually works, or whether it's just the Necron's technology, or whether it's actually a factor of the Flesh Change, their literal bodies being able to power, embody, or otherwise permit the weapon to function in a way that it wouldn't have before the Flesh Change. For example, some of the Canoptic Defenders and Destroyers have weapons grafted into them. It's unclear whether the weapon itself is being powered and operated by them, or whether the weapon in itself would work without the Necron there. And we see some examples of Imperials taking Necron technology and using it in their own, which kind of points it towards more being like more technology, more star matter. But there are also examples of certain Necron weapons that are too difficult or too complex to reverse engineer, and we will also go into that. So, limitation in design and redesign. The Necrons can really only appear and form themselves in a limited number of ways. Now, you can slightly redesign the individual who is using the weapon, so the Necron themselves can be fixed and modified a little bit, but generally they're going to be equipped very basically, and there's not going to be any modification to their weapons or equipment. Now, that's not to say that there aren't heavier or different versions of equipment. Obviously, we'll talk about things like rifles versus heavy weapons, pistols versus, vehicle weapons and things like that. But you couldn't, for example, take a Gaus weapon and as a Stormlord or some other, Necron leader, have that redesigned to work completely differently, where you could have if you had, like, a lasgun. So, there are limits in how much you can tweak the Necron weaponry, and there's only so many special variants you can actually have, and a majority of them are actually tied to the type of Necron that they're attached to. That idea of, like, size matters. Certain Necrons can't use certain weapons, and certain Necrons can only use certain weapons. So, interactions with other materials and forces. So, we're going to talk about this more when we get to the actual weapons, but the Necrons tend to be on the defensive a lot of time. When they are on the offensive, it's usually to go after other Necron tomb worlds, but when they wake up off whatever tomb world they're on, they will find whatever is alive on the planet and commit to the violence against them. They have an interesting system that we'll talk about with the next bullet point, but the real interaction here is that Necrons, when they die, when they are killed, when they are destroyed, again, pretty difficult to do. They are made of metal, but there's plenty of things that can break them, and the metal that they're made of, it's not like hardened steel, it's not like armored steel. It is still steel or iron equivalent, but it is a tiny bit softer. Something like mild steel or rolled steel instead of like rolled armor, something like that. But the materials thing is a lot of their weapons are made out of this living metal, this kind of softer steel alloy, and then it will have blades made out of blackstone or out of some other stuff, some other arcane material, but in general the housings will also be of living metal. The reason for that is their recall protocols. Necrons, when they are killed, they will teleport back to the tomb, they will get reconstituted and repaired by scarabs or by whatever, or they'll be completely recycled and made into a new body. I'm pretty sure that's how it works, or something along those lines. Essentially, the Necron will be recycled and sent out again. Which means that, well, once they're knocked out, their living metal weapons will go with them. The only exceptions to that seems to be when you break off a piece of the weapon and you leave the Necron alive for a certain amount of time, the living metal in the weapon seems to quote-unquote die, and then once it is dead, it can still function, but it will no longer come back with the recall protocols. That's my reasoning for why you could do something like take the blade off of one of their swords, rip off their arm, break that off, and then essentially toss it into a bag, and then run away with it. Eventually, the living metal in the sword will die, the Necron won't get recalled because he's not combat ineffective, and then you have a sword that could theoretically be repowered to be a Necron phase blade, or something of that nature. That doesn't work with every weapon, especially the ones that are harder to separate from their users. For example, you'll notice that a lot of the Gaus weaponry has an ammo pack or a tube that hooks directly up to the Necron using it. Again, almost using their soul or any other material inside of them, that living metal, as fuel for the Gaus weapon itself. And thus separating the Gaus weapon from the Necron will not only cause them to be recalled, because now they don't have a weapon, so the tomb is going to recall them and recall the weapon with them, even if it's separated, but those guys only have one option. So if you had an enemy who had more weapons, you could theoretically sever one or more of those weapons, and if it wasn't recalled after a certain amount of time, the living metal would die, again, theoretically, and then you'd be able to continue using it. That's my reasoning for why things like Imperials use Catan Phase Blades, or some of the Deathwatch use bigger Catan Phase Swords as the equivalent of power weapons. And there are also some Necron weapons that have been co-opted by the Imperium. Very few. We're talking about like extremely rare inquisitorial finds from the Ordo Xenos and things like that. But moving on. Because of this reason, because of this recall protocol, because of the fact that whenever a Necron goes down, it essentially gets recycled, however long that may take, and put back out on the battlefield, there's a lot of aspects of weaponry that we don't really get to talk about with them. Ammunition, kind of a moot concept. Once they run out of ammo, they're going to be feeding off of their own internal supply of power, obviously, but once they run out of ammo, or they would endanger their continued combat effectiveness by using more ammo, they're just going to get recycled. Resupply? Why bother? Unless they're traveling a very long distance from the tomb, in which case some of their ships can actually produce more Necrons. Unless they're traveling a super long distance, why bother with resupply? You can just recycle them. And now this does have an issue with logistics, which is, well, if I recycle this Necron now, because he's become semi-combat ineffective or fully combat ineffective, he's going to have to walk several hundred miles or get transported several hundred miles to get back to me. That is assuming that the Necrons don't have any teleportation available. In a lot of cases, they do. So, again, because the Necrons have teleportation, recycling their own troops, because they don't really need ammunition because they feed off of their own living metal bodies. The real big question is here, does any of that matter? And I'm on the side of, I don't think it does. I really don't think that the Necrons give a single flying heck about resupplying themselves with ammunition or caring all that much about logistics, because, quite frankly, they can afford to lose an entire army and just birth them again. Like, they can print a whole new army. It takes time, it can make them vulnerable, so they don't want to do that. They don't want to lose a whole army, but they can, and it's not the end of the world for them. So I would say, on the side of logistics, resupply, and ammunition, it's a weakness, but it doesn't really matter be-all, end-all wise for how they can move around, or how they can deploy. In addition to that, yeah, the Necrons can often just straight up teleport, whether it's on their own world or between ships and the ground. And when they can't, they suffer no attrition for traveling over land, so they have no problem just hoofing it all that way. And they have transport vehicles, so, all of that. Pros and cons of Necron weapons. So, armor penetration is really the biggest pro here. Almost every Necron weapon, period, By the way, very cool images here. You can see all the Gaus weaponry, how it kind of melts away at material. We'll be talking about that when we go to Gaus Weapons, but this gentleman appears to have his legs severed. Very unfortunate, but we'll talk about him later. Or we'll talk about that type of weapon that's being used against him later. Armor penetration is the big pro for the Necrons. Almost every single weapon in their arsenal either doesn't care about armor protection, or it does really well against heavy armor and against unarmored units. So it's not like something that just does good against armor. It basically, almost all of them, no matter what the type, will either bypass the armor or basically severely limit its effectiveness. Whether it's light armor, it'll just go right through it. If it's medium and heavy armor, it will probably go right through most of it, and if it's a direct hit, it's probably a guaranteed kill. But if it's a glancing hit, they might survive with severe injuries. The only thing that could really put a damper on Necron weaponry is heavy armor like power armor and Terminator armor, or vehicle armor. But even that, standard infantry weapons for the Necrons do actually do a solid amount of damage to tanks. So up to medium armor is still not safe from standard Necron infantry weapons, and the actual heavy and designated armor-piercing weapons will penetrate almost anything unless it's super heavy in weight. So very big pro for them. Rate of fire is the first big con. A lot of the Necron weapons have this trade-off of a lot of power and a lot of hitting and killing power and armor penetration in exchange for being relatively slow firing. They don't have a ton of fully automatic weaponry. Some of it shoots a continuous beam, but it's not a permanent beam. It's not like a continuous beam. It's just one short beam for a short amount of time, up to a second or so. But this is the big downside of having that. They're really only firing once, then twice, then 3 times. They need to take a break between shots, and this essentially limits the amount of targets that they can engage. It limits the number of times that they can hit the same target, and it slows the follow-up shot. So there's going to be a gap between when a Necron fires and when they get another shot off, essentially. So rate of fire, big negative. Ammunition supply, I'd put this as kind of moot. Again, I believe that the ammo is drawn from within the Necron. Essentially, their living metal is giving energy or material to the weapon itself. And once they pull off enough of the metal, they will weaken themselves and get reabsorbed and kind of recycled again. So, ammunition supply is a little bit moot. There's probably limitations in how many shots that they can take. I would say that range is somewhere around 100 for the standard infantry weapons. It might be considerably less. But I would say to be safe and to be on the more even-handed side, I'd say around 100 shots for something like a standard Gaus weapon. Probably a lot less than that if it's a bigger one. But, yeah, ammo supply is just kind of moot. Range. Now, a lot of Necron weapons on tabletop have kind of mediocre or medium range. I think that this is really more of an aspect of the speed at which their rounds fly. So we'll talk about this in beam versus blast and length of bolt. A lot of the Necron weapons can travel a good distance, but they are projecting a beam, and it's not going as fast as the speed of light like a lasgun is. It is a field or a power or an extension of energy that is, we'll talk about it, very technological in origin, so it's not like plasma and it's not like a laser. It's traveling at somewhere between those two in speed, and there are faster or slower ones, but I'm talking about basic ones here. So, while I do believe that they can hit things at range, I would say they'd probably lose effectiveness somewhere around 300 to 500 meters. It would also be a factor of they don't travel as fast as a bullet or as a las blast, so they would probably be easier to get out of the way of. And if you were trying to hit a moving target with a Gaus weapon at that kind of medium to long range, 500 meters and above, you're probably not going to hit it all that well. Not necessarily because of lack of accuracy, just because of the slowness of the bolt. Again, there are exceptions to this, but in general, because of the slowness of the bolt and because of the slowness of the rate of fire, or the speed of the rate of fire. So, arguable there. Could be going a lot of distance, but it is pretty obvious that Necron weapons do lose effectiveness with distance, like any energy weapon, essentially, other than the plasma weapons. So, again, questionable there. back and forth on that. I'd put it as neutral, because at standard infantry range, it will do standard infantry weaponry, or standard infantry things, for accuracy. But beyond that, it might start losing effectiveness, it might start losing cohesion, and it will definitely be easier to get out of the way of, because it is not traveling as fast as certain other weapons like bullets or lasers. The damage effect and the effect on different targets, I'm going to tie these in. These are definitely pluses. So a lot of the Necron weapons will either disintegrate targets, or they will have severe after effects to the target. Talking about like fields that will explode you, or shooting antimatter at you, that kind of like super sci-fi murdery stuff. So the damage effect on target is very lethal and incredibly brutal. The wounds delivered by Necron weapons are almost universally either fatal or crippling, even from a glancing hit. So you might say that, well, if you get a shot off that manages to just hit somebody in the shoulder, it can do extensive damage even if it just has localized hits. So if you hit somebody in the hand, it might do damage all the way up to their elbow. Or if it's certain weapons, it might just outright kill them because it's doing secondary effect damage. Effect on different targets. Like I said, a lot of Necron weapons are both good against infantry and good against vehicles. But that doesn't mean they all are. And the other thing is that people overstate a lot about how much armor penetration the Necron weapons do, especially Gaus Weapons. There are definitely vehicles that will be proof or heavily resistant to standard Necron infantry weapons. That doesn't mean you want to be taking multiple hits in the same spot on your armor. For example, I would argue probably 3 or 4 Gaus weapon hits to the same spot on a Leman Russ would probably eat through it, just because it's weakening the same section of armor over and over and over again. And at that point, you're obviously going to have to worry about it, but let's be real, that's not disabling the tank. It is making a hole, but that's a patchable thing that can be fixed. And the after effect damage on the vehicle might be very little. So it does have that localized effect issue, and its secondary damage, unless it gets full penetration, is pretty low. So you just have to be concerned about what you're firing at. Infantry, go ahead. Tanks, you might want to get a couple of buddies, and you might want to fire at some things that matter a lot more, like the turret ring, the tracks, the engine, maybe fire at the weapons themselves to try and disable them. But yeah, it has different effects on different targets is my main point. So I'd put that as neutral, but damage effect is definitely a plus. The Necrons attached to the weapons, do they matter? So this is an interesting thing as well. We talk a lot about, like, destroyers or standard Necrons having the same type of weapon, but it's a different gauge or a different grade or a different size. This matters a lot, not only for the fact that it is essentially putting more liquid metal into the weapon, or more living metal into the weapon, to provide it with more quote-unquote ammunition or hitting power, but those bigger Necrons have larger energy sources, quote-unquote, to work with. So they are able to boost the output of the weapon significantly, which would make them more cannons or something like that, and it's why things like guards or much larger Necrons can manage those bigger heavy weapons. Not to say that the smaller ones couldn't do that, it's just in many cases they can't, or they don't. Sorry, that was a stupid thing to say. It's not to say that the smaller ones wouldn't like to use them, but there is physical limitations to how much energy they can output. That's more what I meant. The final one, numbers, advantages, and disadvantages. So, on two sides the Necron armies are. On one side, you get lots of Necrons all together working with every asset available, aircraft, void, infantry, heavy weapons, vehicles, scarabs, all of that stuff, working in concert where it's a real awakened tomb world. Everybody's awake, everybody's thinking in concert, everyone's working together under the oversight of the Necron Lord. That's the biggest side. On the other side, you have tomb worlds or crown worlds that wake up piecemeal. One or another units might wake up. Necrons might just, get awakened by accident and just kind of go around doing their basic protocols, protect the other forces, kill anything that isn't a Necron. Those ones are going to be in smaller numbers, they're going to be more erratic, they're going to be less organized. And while they might still be able to recycle themselves, they won't necessarily be able to do so at the same rate because not the entire tomb has woken up yet. So a lot of the systems that they would use to supply themselves might not be ready for them just yet. Again, that will come as the tomb becomes more awakened, but on the one side, the advantages to the larger numbers, or to any number of Necrons, is they're all equipped relatively uniformly. They're all very tough, because they're made out of metal. They're all equipped with these very high armor penetration, low logistics need because they can recycle, and pretty effective against lots of different targets weaponry. On the downside, there are limitations to Necrons in terms of speed. They're not very fast. Their reaction speeds aren't great. They have specialty versions that are pretty good at that, but all of them are essentially only as tough as their actual materials. So they have weaknesses that can definitely be exploited. They're kind of slow. At the beginning, when they're not fully awake, they can be kind of dumb. They don't necessarily have that massive overarching mind keeping track of them just yet. The other thing is that, with the recycling, it is not instantaneous, so if you can kill a large Necron host, they're not going to be back instantly, necessarily. It may take them a bit, it may give you a window of opportunity to go and try and attack the tomb directly. The other disadvantage with numbers that is also slightly an advantage, when you have lots of Necrons, that rate of fire issue and that reaction speed issue and the accuracy issue aren't so much of a problem, because you can all coordinate fire pretty easily, because Necrons are essentially working together. They are, all on the same side here, working with, brain, mental intelligence as machines. Living machines, but still. Then the disadvantage of that is when you don't have a ton of Necrons around, and you might have a couple squads of infantry, you can kind of get kited around and maybe sniped out by units that have better range than you, better situational awareness, better speed, maybe some hard-hitting weapons. So, for example, if there was a squad of 10 Necron warriors with standard Gaus flares, and there was a squad of guardsmen, the guardsmen, if they had somebody who had a long las, could pretty much mop up that entire squad of Necrons without suffering anyone wounded or killed. How? Effectively, you would stay at long range with them and burst them down, move a little bit, burst them down from the next position, move a little bit. But this is assuming that they aren't connected with all of the other Necrons yet, and they don't have any supplies to call in. Again, a lasgun is going to harm the Necron, but it's probably not going to outright kill them all that easily. It will certainly take, 10, 15 shots before you can really put a standard warrior down. Assuming you don't hit them in the head a couple times. If you're just going for chest shots, yeah, it's going to take 10, maybe 20 shots. Especially at the ranges that we're talking about here. But I'm not saying it's not dangerous, I'm just saying that if you have the range on some disorganized Necrons, and you have some weapons that can take them out pretty consistently, and you have the freedom of movement, you will have a significant advantage because you're essentially playing to all the weaknesses that they have. And then finally, the last one that we need to talk about before we go into every single type of weapon is beams versus blast and length of bolt. So, beam weapons are all of the weapons that shoot a continuous or a small length of energy or energized, essentially material, or energized energy in a pocket or a packet towards a target. These are not what I would call inert materials, but these are essentially the thing that does the damage. The beam is in a single discrete strip, and it is going towards the target at a high speed, slower than that of a bullet, but still at a high speed, probably above that of plasma, I would argue, somewhere between there. And that's what does the damage. It doesn't have any secondary effect, it's just going through, and if it's the case with the Gaus flare, it's separating the atomic connections between materials. That's all that it does. It essentially goes in the material, directly attacks the connection between atoms, and separates them, causing it to disintegrate. Then the other side of that for Necron weapons is blast. So blast weapons have either a secondary effect, so they will hit a target and explode, or they will hit a target and electrocute them, or jump to another target, or it will have some secondary effect, which we'll talk about. Now, length of bolt actually refers to something I was talking about during the range section. On the side of beams, they are traveling at a speed below that of a bullet or a laser. It's not the speed of light here. So you can get partial hits with a beam, meaning that you can graze someone or you can graze a target where some of the energy latches on and does its work, but it's not getting the full hit in. And length of bolt, or how long the beam is, literally how much energy is put into the strike, that matters a lot when we get to heavier weapons. Not to mention that you can fire more than one beam, whereas blast weapons tend to be single target or single shot. And blast weapons, you won't get that like partial hit. You'll either hit or miss most of the time. So, moving on to the fun part that everyone actually came here for. How it works, the logic section and analysis. Protection, type, damage prevention, mitigation, counters. These are Necrons. There's very little you can actually do to mitigate or counter this stuff. So, let's start off with the fun ones. The Gaus weaponry, or Gaus weapons. We'll be talking about this for a bit. These are energy disintegrator weapons, and I do mean disintegration in the classic sense, where atoms or cells, any material that had an ionic or a chemical bond to one another, are getting severed with energy, essentially with electricity. So, the energy disintegrators, you have the Gaus Flare up here and the Gaus Blaster down here. Again, that two-beam, much stronger heavy weapon, and then the single kind of rifle weapon. And then you have down here the image of what happens to you when you take a full-power, direct-fire Gauss blast to the face. So, this is worst possible case scenario, right? You are an Imperial Guardsman in light flak armor, and you have taken a full Gauss blast to the face. This dude literally gets hit, like, directly in the mouth, basically. And you can see what it does. That green energy, that beam that it fires, goes into his body. It goes directly into him, so it doesn't, like, impact him kinetically. It doesn't have any necessarily kickback to his touching him. But as it goes through his body, as it enters his armor, as it enters his flesh, his bones, all of that, this green lightning stuff, is essentially an energizing of the atoms of the connections between the atoms in his armor. So, you know, all atoms attached to each other via again, electron transfer. They're all touching each other. They're all, you know, vibrating together at a certain speed, and they are making a solid because of their organization and how they are combined or how they are bonded. The electricity in this, again, I'm not a chemist here, just a military guy, or historian. So, excuse my bad chemistry terminology, but they're bonded together in some way. All the Gauss weapon does is sever those bonds. Now, it has a limit in how much energy it can release and how many bonds it can sever, but as you can see here, it is definitely enough to turn your face, head, arm, and chest into a pile of loose atoms. And that is considerably worse with the Gauss Blaster. So, these are super nasty, and when I see these used, I'm like, that would be super good against a lot of stuff. There is a negative side, though. Because it affects things based on their bonding, and it has a limitation in the energy that it can affect, there will be things that it has a harder time, essentially, unbonding. You'll notice here, what's the first thing to go with this guy? What is the first thing that becomes, that starts falling apart? It's his uniform, his arm, his flesh, his bones, but what's the last thing to go? You can see his shoulder plate and the chest plate. They're showing a lot more energy and static discharge, right? That indicates that essentially this beam or blast is struggling, not failing, but struggling to give enough energy to disintegrate them because ceramite and flakweave are both thicker, made of more material, and they are more chemically stable, in the case of ceramite, or chemically neutral or non-reactive, in comparison to things like flesh, bone, cloth. Again, flak may be cloth, but is underneath material here. But you can see it's still eating through it. It's still actively discharging energy to separate the atomic bonds in the material, and it is breaking it down into this kind of mess of loose atomic structure. So, horrible way to die. Relatively painless, probably, because if it does hit you like this guy right in the face, you just die of brain damage almost instantly. So it's probably horrifyingly painful for about a millisecond, and then all of your atoms die at once, and you just kind of dead. So that's Gaus weaponry. They're really cool. Honestly, of all the Necron weapons, other than the Phase Blades, Gaus weapons are absolutely my favorite. I love them. I also love the fact that, unlike a lot of other Necron weapons, almost all of the Gaus weapons have a secondary bayonet or axe. You never see the Necrons actually using these, But for me, it's a real comfort to know that Necrons feel like they have the ability to use a melee weapon, to use this kind of like halberd or axe as a bayonet. You know, just a thing of me of like, I don't like factions that have exclusively ranged weapons necessarily, and as much as the Necrons do use swords, it's also nice to know that the average Necron warrior still has a melee weapon to fall back on. I don't know, I find that very cool. Especially because this is all made of living metal, so that's technically part of them, by some definition. So, yeah, either way, Hyperphase in and out of reality blades. So, this is the Hyperphase blade for the Calidus Assassin. It's on her wrist. You can see here the little wrist gauntlet, and this is the more standard one that the Necrons use. Some of these do get stolen by the Death Watch, and used essentially the same way that the Necrons use them. How do they use them? Well, when I say in and out of reality blades, what I mean by that is the Hyperphase blade phases in and out of this dimension. Why does that matter, and why should that do anything? Because, you know, phasing something out of reality, why would you want a sword that disappears? Well, the thing is, it doesn't necessarily disappear, one, along its entire length, and two, it reappears and separates material inside of it. What does that mean? So, imagine a scenario, shall we? A Necron with a big sword walks up to a Space Marine, and the Space Marine says, "Haha, you cannot possibly cut me with your little sword. That's just going to bounce off of my armor." The Necron takes a swing, and instead of hitting the Marine's armor, the blade slides right through, because the section that touched the armor doesn't exist in our reality anymore, and then it appears inside of the Marine, cutting him, and then disappears again, and the Necron takes it back out again. That's essentially how the Hyperphase blades work. They go into a target by phasing out of reality, bypassing armor, protection, all kinds of stuff. It could even bypass stuff like bones and go straight for like vital organs. And again, it's not clear whether the entire blade disappears and drops off to another dimension, but whatever part of it does drop off and become part of another dimension will reappear inside of the target, and then either disappear again, allowing you to remove the weapon without actually cutting through the protection, or it will just be drawn out through the wound. Because an interesting thing with 40k teleportation, it does cut through material. So a Terminator that is teleported can go right into the ground, and he will essentially just, be stuck there. And, it moves all of the material that would be taking his place away from him. Which means that when the Xenophase blade, or when the Hyperphase blade, cuts through a target, it isn't just, appearing inside of them. It's literally taking all of the material that should be in the place the blade is, and shoving it away from itself, and theoretically causing some serious damage. I'm talking if you stab someone in the stomach, you're cutting through their flesh, through their organs. If you stab someone with the Xenophase blade, you might be slashing them across the chest, and it looks like you just went right through them, but in reality, you just, severed an artery next to their heart, and they just die, in their own blood. That's if you're, really lucky, or if you're a Calidus and you're going right for a heart shot. The more realistic thing would be okay, you're in heavy armor, I'm going to turn my sword off of this plane for a couple seconds, shove it into your torso, cause it to re-emerge in our reality for a half second. All of your organs rupture as they're suddenly under a ton of pressure from a blade that wasn't there a second ago, and they're being shoved apart, and I've also sliced through your lower intestine, and then I'm going to rip it back out again. So these are horrifying. They can chop off big sections of limbs, they can stab right into stuff like vehicles, and then push the armor aside. I don't think they can go, they have limitations on how much they can actually damage, and, theoretically sticking the sword into somewhere where it doesn't belong could damage it, especially when you're trying to retrieve it. So if I stabbed a Xenophase blade like the arm one that the Calidus uses into a Marine, and then I made it reappear and the entire length of the blade reappeared, it would make a hole in his armor, sure, but if I tried to draw it out at an angle, or if he turned around quickly, I could quite easily snap off the blade, because it's not very thick. And while it does seem to be made of metal or possibly blackstone, it's not clear, it's not really obvious that it is super durable. The Necron blades tend to be durable, but the thinner ones might not be. So that kind of idea of turning it off when it touches a target or turning a section of it off, then turning it back on again inside of the target to hit something lethal, and then turning it back off again and withdrawing it is a super complicated, but a very easy way to get a lethal hit on an enemy who's in impenetrable armor, essentially. Hyperphase Blade is very cool. It has a lot of different uses, but it's mostly used for the Necrons by their big old warrior beasts, and a lot of them are used by their leadership. Now, I've seen some people use power weapons to duel these. There are some examples of this. I'm not sure how that would work. Matter of fact, I don't think it would, because theoretically the Phase Blade would have to overcome the power of the Power Sword, as they're both trying to cut into each other. The Phase Blade trying to come back into reality using energy, and the Power Sword trying to destroy the Phase Blade when it came back into reality. It might damage the Power Sword more than the Phase Sword, or the Phase Sword more than the Power Sword. I think if they were both in reality, or in real space, the Xenos Blades are, usually when the Necrons are using them, tough enough to fight with. But if you were using, say, the little one that the Calidus uses, and you're trying to fight a power weapon, I would try and avoid the power weapon as much as possible, and just try and kill them with the Phase Blade. So yeah, I don't think they would work all that well as dueling weapons, if I'm being honest. And that actually bears out with how a lot of Necron leadership use them. They use them in, like, spears or other kind of designatedly offensive weapons, and they just make up, like, the tips of the weapon, so they can kind of stab, penetrate, turn it on, it turns back into reality, kills them, and then they draw it out again. Something like that. Enmitic, or enmitic, enemitic weapons. I have no idea how to pronounce that. Sorry. These are reversed gravity guns. You see them with this good old Spider-Man here. He's got a creepy smile. And the big old destroyers, they have like a triple-barreled or a six-barreled heavy version of these. The amnitic weapons are reverse gravity guns. So we've already talked about before how gravity guns or graviton weapons create a squish field, or it expels an energetic field to a target that forces higher density material to the center, and it will essentially crush all of that material into one point. The amnitic weapons are the opposite of that. It expands a field, hits a target, and then shoves all of the material away from the field. This is horrifying. It would be similar to an explosion inside of the body or on the face of the body if this hit you directly. It would kind of just expand, and it would force all of the material in, like, your chest cavity to expand with it. Very lethal, obviously. Nobody wants their heart to suddenly get pulverized. But it has some odd quirks. It seems to work only in, like, heavy weapons or in these little pistols. So I think the pistol ones would probably be best against infantry, doing things like breaking open people's armor by literally ripping it apart, shredding it, essentially, as the force of this gravity expansion field separates things, like, kinetically, like, shreds them apart. But it would also be effective on the larger side of being like, well, I'm going to take the front of that tank, and I'm going to rip the literal armor open like I'm tearing open a tin can. It would have a similar effect to that. Now, obviously, it has the same disadvantages of gravity weapons, which is you probably need to focus the field for a few seconds. It has limitations against multiple targets, obviously, but that's why this guy has 6 guns, so he can hit 6 targets at a time. But, yeah, it's a pretty nasty, gnarly weapon, but there's some severe limitations on how it can be employed, and it obviously takes a ton of power to use. Particle weapons. These ones are sci-fi as heck, and I really love them. Super limited. They are only on vehicles, as far as I could find. There might be a couple of special ones that are like relics, or maybe one on a vehicle that I might have missed. But these are dark matter guns. So, if you don't know what dark matter is, we're going to be talking about it a lot in the Xenos videos. I'm going to be honest, the Eldar and Dark Eldar both use kind of dark matter guns. But the Eldar use a very different form of it. Theirs is from a lot of different sources. It's kind of like the discount dark matter. The Necrons use legit dark matter from, like, the center of black holes. It essentially shoots anti-material, so anti-protons, dark matter, towards material, protons, and it results in a predictively horrible explosion as anti-proton hits proton, anti-electron hits anti-electron, energy is exchanged, massive explosion. Now, with a particle weapon, it doesn't need to be more than a couple of atoms to give you a pretty solid detonation. You know, hand grenade or such. The Necrons shoot them out in, like, a little clump. Which, holy hell, whenever these are used, it is the equivalent of, like, a super heavy artillery round going off. Because when it bonds with material, which it does because it is negatively charged and positively charged on the outside rather than positively charged and negatively charged on the outside, when it bonds with other material, anti meets pro, pro meets anti, and all of the material in between them essentially detonates. So, much like a nuclear explosion, a dark matter gun would take a very small amount of essentially reversed fissile material and shatter all of the atoms in the enemy's, in the enemy's being. Just in the enemy, period. So, dark matter guns and particle weapons in general, super destructive, great at armor penetration, you're turning the literal armor into a bomb, and then on top of that, for a very small expenditure of the particles, you can cause a remarkable explosion. So, very dangerous. I would be so scared of one of, even if I was a Necron Lord, I would be so scared of one of these breaching containment, because it will even react with oxygen. It will react with the air antimatter, or dark matter. It will react with any atom, essentially, that is positive charge in the center to create an explosion. So, the dark matter or particle weapons probably have some sort of projector that projects a little bit of energy or a little bit of a containment field around the dark matter until it hits its target. Otherwise, it would probably just detonate the second it left the gun. So, yeah, that kind of idea, like the plasma gun, of bottling up something very dangerous and explosive and throwing it at a target that is hopefully far away and watching it detonate in the distance. I am a little bit overselling it here, but as far as I can tell, that's what the lore says about the particle weapons, is that it's a literal dark matter cannon. And because it's only on vehicles, it's a pretty solid weapon, like, explosive-wise. Finally, Tesla weapons, and we'll ignore the does size matter because we've already been over that. Tesla weapons, these are the angry extending lightning guns. So, these can be used by a lot of different forces. A lot of them are on the smaller side, but it's more of that blast weapon. It hits a target, and it draws off energy from them as it literally zaps them. So we talked about, like, lightning claws before, how electricity can do stuff like mess up systems. Even if it doesn't kill the target, the electricity can, scorch you, damage your flesh, cause you brain damage, kill you, stop your heart, etc. But even if it doesn't do that, it can do stuff like blacken your limbs, it can cause you to lose vision, it can burn you, it can light you on fire. But the cool thing with Tesla weapons is they don't just hit one target and expend all their energy. No, it's way worse than that. They will shoot to another target. Essentially, they draw energy from your body. All of the neurons and nerves firing in your body are essentially drawing electricity, a little bit of it, but still electricity, and then it will jump to another target. So this means that not only if you shot something like a Space Marine, it would go between the Space Marine and his armor, and then the next Space Marine over and his armor, and it would continue drawing energy until it ran out, essentially. But it also means that if you hit, like, a tank, it would hit the tank, then the crew, then the engine, then the tank, then the crew, then the crew, then the engine, and it would kind of bounce around, theoretically, inside of the vehicle. Again, that's not likely to happen, just because there's very little amounts of, like, actual electricity in a human being. The Tesla weapon says that it gets stronger with every target that it hits. I think logic would dictate the exact opposite of that. Because it can only draw a small amount of energy from any one target, it would probably be going down in energy over time. Though that is what the lore says. That might be with the assumption that it is killing the target. Because drawing all the electric energy, all the chemo-electric energy in a human, might be able to sustain it to the next target. But if it's not an outright kill, it probably will lose energy over time. And of course, if the Tesla weapon had infinite energy, it would just continue hitting targets. We know that it doesn't, so we know that must not be the case. So, Tesla weapons likely able to hit 5 or so human targets, probably, until it is either out of energy or it can't find another target close enough. The other thing is that Tesla weapons do need to be close to their next target in order to jump. So, moving on. patterns and types. So there's a couple of things, but a lot of the Necrons don't seem to use pistols. So we've talked about this before. Here's one of the dark matter projectors. Here's the Tesla gun. A lot of the Necron weapons just are kind of cool and space-looking and silvery. This is a brain static rifle. It's kind of like a mix between the Gauss flare and the Tesla gun. Here's another cool Tesla gun. But this one, the kind of brain scrambler rifle, is used by Deathmarks. It can literally turn off the electrical signals in your brain. So it is essentially the brain damage gun. It is literally the brain damage gun. I don't know how you would survive a hit with that unless you were in some sort of very heavy armor. We see power armored Space Marines kind of survive it a little bit. A couple of like glancing hits or hits that don't hit them directly in the head. But if you're a normal human and you get hit with the literal brain scrambler rifle, I think you're probably out of luck. God, I love that it's literally just like the brain scrambler. All that it's for is to turn your little mortal brain off. Funny weapon, definitely cool. I'm not a huge fan of Deathmarks on tabletop, but I do like their lore. Then over here we have more Hyperphase weapons. We have the War Scythe, which is kind of a classic leadership unit thing. The Void Blade, I'm not sure how these ones work, but it's another one of those phase swords. And the classy Hyperphase sword. So, big thing here, we've already talked about heavy weapons and vehicle weapons, how they're just bigger versions of these. Melee weapons, again, some of them have melee weapons on them, some of them just have, like, spiky bits that you could probably hit someone with. But the standard melee weapons are up here. Most of them are hyperphase weapons. Some of them are more standard, like the ones we talked about before, like the bayonets for the Gaus Weapons. But, pistols. Why do the Necrons not seem to use pistols outside of this one little gunslinger here with his amnitic pistols? I think it has a lot to do with that the change thing. Every Necron, when he came into the change, he was equipped with his rifle or his weapon, and the port or the energy source or whatever he uses to power that weapon or equipment can't really be changed. And since it is his power source, since it is literally powering everything about him, his cognition, his movement, his weapon, everything, adding another weapon that he might not be using at all times is not only a drain on the liquid metal powering him, or on the living metal powering him, it's a drain on the energy that might not be worth it. So, a lot of Necron weapons don't necessarily have pistol variants, but they might have heavy variants. For the reason that the standard Necron warrior, if they can't handle it, or if they can't handle a second weapon, it might not be worth it. And if they had a second weapon, it might decrease the amount of time that they can be in combat because it's drawing more power from them. Users' importance and logistics. Main thing here, it's Necrons, obviously. By the way, another Xenophase Blade is the War Scythe. There's two different versions. This is kind of the blade one. I like this one a lot, but the more common one is the one that looks like a scythe. Your opinions on those, I like them both, but I prefer the straight up and down one, the more halberd style. So, Necrons come in two forms. We got Crown Worlds and Tomb Worlds. Tomb Worlds are a little bit smaller. They've got less important people running them. Lords that have less clout, essentially, and they'll have less special options. The other part is Crown Worlds, which are the really big ones. They've got all different types of things. The big things that are different with these is their naval forces, which we'll go into if we do an Armories video, and also the constructs they have access to. One of the big things with constructs is that they're not necessarily straight-up Necrons, like they're not human, quote-unquote, or they were never human. The Destroyers and the Lords and the Warriors and the Guards, they all were. But the Scarabs and these tripod walker guys and some of the vehicles were never actually Necrons. They might have some sort of Necron intelligence in them, but even like the Mega Scarabs, like these ones, not really ever human. But they use similar weapons and equipment. I don't think I've missed anything that they use. Some of the guards do have shields, but they work pretty much exactly like you would think a shield works, so I don't think I need to explain that. Nightmare creatures. They do have a couple of weirdos in their ranks. These include the big old tripod walkers. They have lots of good Gaus weaponry and stuff like that. They have the destroyers and scorpex and all that stuff. These are essentially Necrons that are particularly hateful of all things alive. All Necrons hate living things, but some Necrons hate more than others. And they get messed up like that. The other fun thing, and one of my favorite units in the entire Necron roster, I have a couple of favorites, but my absolute favorite is 100% got to love me flares. I love flares. And that'll come into when we talk about normal weapons here. So, in Necron hands, like power weapons, standard energy, or melta weapons, these exist. They have them. They show up on occasion, both Melta and standard energy weapons, in addition to regular power weapons. They kind of work exactly the same as ours in the Imperium. You know, they don't have too much difference. They just are more green, they draw off the Necron involved, and they might be limited to certain forms. Now, normal weapons, we also have to talk about we have to talk about Necron flayers and the Flayer virus, and the few Flayer lords out there. So, the Flayer virus, the virus that causes the Necrons to kind of lose their mind, want to coat themselves in living flesh and skin, and it modifies their living metal, it modifies their flesh so that they can't use weapons, they just kind of have long, nasty claws that they scuttle around and cut you with. Now, this was a result of one of two things. One of the original things was that it was some sort of defect in the process that made them, and they'd always been like that. I prefer the different version. The different version says that, well, the Flayers went absolutely insane, because most of them are crazy. So, why did they go insane? It's because the Flayers awoke before the rest of their brothers, and before the Tomb World was awake, in order to let them out. So essentially, they were stuck on whatever tomb ship, or whatever tomb world, completely inert, unable to activate, unable to move, unable to go around, unable to communicate, and unable to move their bodies, for millennia. Left in utter silence, in utter solitude, unable to do so much as move a muscle or an eye, conscious of this for millennia. And that drove them completely insane. To the point where all that they can do is, much like a serial killer, they just want to feel human again. And they're willing to modify themselves, or they're unwilling to do anything that doesn't get them closer to that flesh, that skin. They want to have essentially the most of their humanity back, or their mortal lives back, which is why they go and flay targets and then cover themselves in the skin in this macabre fashion. And the Flayer virus can extend. It can infect other Necrons, which is horrifying. And the Necrons know this, and they do not like to keep a lot of Flayers around for this reason. So yeah, that's the Flayers. I like them a lot. I'll talk about them more in a Necron Armies video, but whew, there's the first Xenos weapon video done. I really hope that you enjoyed. Got some lovely Flayers here. They coming up from the ground with their little claws. We've got our boy here, his big tank self, that he particularly hates everything alive. Some good memes here, but either way, this is the first one for now. I'm going to try and do one a day for the next few days. I might have to take a short time once the next Xenos videos are done to move on to the next type of them. The next type of videos, whether it's going to be an Adversaries video or an Armies video, I'll have to see. Remember, vote in the poll on what archive video we're doing next. It looked like Void, Shields, and Fields were winning. I'm on board with that, but once we get archive going, once we get all of these going, once I have one in every type, I will start going Armory, Armies, Adversaries, and then Archive, and I will continue with that cycle. Essentially, I will give you guys prompts for what type of X video we want, and then I will let you guys comment if you want anything differently. So, I hope this has been a good video for you all, and I wish you all a lovely good night.